Hello and welcome to Rach Aquarelle. In this time-lapse video, I'm going to show you my process of painting this fuzzy bee in watercolor. And before we get started with that, let's go over the colors that I will use. So I'll be using a warm yellow, a cool yellow, a warm red, a cool red, a warm blue, a cool blue, and I will also be using a neutral gray, such as Payne's gray, as well as an earth tone. Mine is burnt umber, but any earth tone will do. And if you are in the market for watercolors, I do recommend Winsor & Newton or Daniel Smith. That's the brands that I use. But of course there are many high quality brands available, and as long as you have a warm and cool version of the primary colors, a few earth tones, a gray, then you really will be set to follow along with this tutorial and really any tutorial that I do. So let's get started. And I do have the full length version of this painting available on my YouTube channel if you are interested in watching that as well to get a little bit more detail about my process. The first thing that I'm doing with this painting is using a wet block-in of my cool yellow. So I first applied some clear water to the body of the bee, and then I used my cool yellow to block in the entire body of the bee, as well as the stamen of the flower, and also the stems and leaves of the flower. And now I'm using warm yellow just to add a little bit of variation. And I'm applying this warm yellow on the body of the bee in areas where the yellow parts and the dark brown parts are going to converge, because those parts are going to look a little bit orange. And now I'm using my cool red to block in the petals of the flower. And I'm also using it to just begin glazing into the stamen and creating some variation and differentiating each individual part. But I like to start out very simple with some simple washes to establish a base color. Okay, so that's it for my block-in. I'm now using a dry brush glaze of my cool red to begin identifying parts of the bee that appear a little bit orange. And if you take a look at the reference photo that I was using, which I have linked in the description below, you'll see that the areas where the dark parts of the bee and the yellow parts meet, it creates a little bit of an orange effect. Now I'm using a glaze of more cool red. This time I'm allowing it to be a little bit brighter, and I'm using that to begin establishing parts of the petals that are either in shadow or they just aren't receiving quite as much light as the lightest petals. But I want to make sure that I don't completely cover up or obliterate those light areas, because those petals, I want to maintain a sense of how delicate and translucent they are. And now I'm using that same cool red with, again, just a dry brush glaze technique to further establish some of the texture of the bee. And I know that that mix went really fast, but I used some ultramarine blue, my cool blue, and my warm red to create a light violet wash. And I'm glazing that in the areas of the bee where it's going to be darker. I don't want to go too extreme with my darks initially because I want to be able to add texture to those areas, and I won't be able to get a good texture effect if I have a base layer that's too dark. So I need some light areas so that I can apply dark texture on top and have that look really soft rather than flat. And even though that mix was a violet mix, I often will use glazing to get optical mixes. So when I applied that violet on top of that yellow base wash, which was already dry, it begins to create a sense of that area being brown. For the flower, I'm mixing my cool red with just a little bit of my cool blue, and I'm very carefully identifying parts of the petals that are in shadow. I don't want to overdo the shadows on these petals just because those petals are very delicate and translucent. So I was very careful not to overdo it. And those will probably be the only shadows that I apply on the flower. I'm now applying a glaze of my warm red onto the stems and leaves. And I do this in order to establish a nice warm undertone, which I think looks very natural for green areas of plant life. And now I'm also applying just a bit of a yellow wash on the lightest parts of the petals. And now using more of my warm red to boost some of the bright, bold colors of those petals. But again, just being very careful not to overdo it. And with these buds underneath the main flower, I'm going to keep those pretty simple, just adding a little bit of texture and variation to them. And I'll keep returning to the stamen of the flower to make sure that I'm differentiating the individual parts from one another. But I want to do that gradually. Now I'm going back into the body of the bee and reestablishing some of those areas that appear a little bit orange, using a dry brush technique in order to get a varied texture. But I'm not worried about texture too much at this point. I'm keeping everything on the bee pretty general. Now again, I'm just going back in with a little bit more of my cool red and finding areas in the flower that need to be boosted a little bit, looking for areas within the stamen that need to be separated and defined. But at no point do I want to completely cover up any of those base washes that I had applied. I'm now using a more concentrated warm yellow to begin building a little bit of texture within the lightest areas of the bee's body. And now I'm applying a green glaze over the stems and leaves of the flower. And you can see that some of that warm undertone is able to show through that glaze. And I think that that really helps give a very natural look to greens in plants. I typically find if I just go right into those areas with a mix of yellow and blue, that it's very difficult to get it to look natural. It just, to me, looks a little bit artificial. And now I'm applying more of a bluish green glaze to the areas that are getting more shadow. And I think that you can already see that this process, although a little bit counterintuitive, it really does help create a very natural look. And now I'm using a mix of my cool blue and my burnt umber to create a dark brown. And I'm using that to begin establishing some texture in the dark parts of the bee. And I'm keeping my brush very dry at this point. I don't want too much water because that allows me to keep my strokes separate from one another and begin to establish texture. And I think that you can see how having those lighter browns underneath really helps boost that sense of texture. Now I'm going in with my warm red, and I'm looking for areas that need to be boosted a little bit more in terms of orange. And I'm applying this again with a very dry brush, not much water on there, so that I can really control my strokes and keep them differentiated from one another. Now I'm using my cool yellow just to go in and add some highlights and some really bright greens by glazing on the stems and leaves, just the areas that are getting a lot of light. And also applying some more bluish green glazes. So you can see that the flower is very close to being finished at this point. And now I'm using my Payne's Gray, my neutral gray, very concentrated, very dry, so I have a lot of pigment on my brush, not much water, and I'm using that to really get into the dark areas of the bee to create some really strong dark texture. And especially with the underside of the bee that's not getting as much light, I want to make sure that I'm using a nice cool neutral gray, very, very dark and concentrated, so that I can use that to help create the impression of form on this bee. And in all of the areas where the yellow and the dark meet, I'm being very careful to apply my strokes in a way that I get a gradual shift so that it looks as though those hairs are overlapping one another and there isn't just a blocky separation between the colors. And the use of orange is also very important to get that sense of gradual shifting between those colors. A project like this can take a lot of patience, but typically I find the process very relaxing and immersive. but this is also a good project to work on for maybe just 10-15 minutes at a time. Put it down, take a break, and come back to it. And now I'm just doing some of the final details, just continuing to make sure that these shifts between the colors are very natural looking, making sure that my texture looks very natural and not overdone, and just some final little details on the flower. I'll even use just a little bit of that violet to add a little bit of shadow to the stamen, which will be very subtle but effective. Adding a little bit of texture to those buds. And using a lot of my cool blue just to go back into the stems and leaves and amplify some of those shadows, as well as the really dark areas on the bee. And at this stage I can basically just use my ultramarine blue, my cool blue, in a very concentrated way, so lots of pigment, not much water. And I can use that just to really establish some shadow areas in the body of the bee. And because it's already so dark, you really won't see the blue outright. The last thing I'm doing is just using a white gel pen to add a little bit of glare to the eye, and also just a few little notes of white fiber in the body of the bee, being very careful not to overdo that. And that is my process. So as I said, there is a full-length real-time video linked below if you care to watch that. And I think that this was a really good general overview of the process, and I hope that you liked it. I hope that you will subscribe and leave me a comment.